Afternoon. Just starting with lecture 2, causes of terror, or what is a terrorist, and the difference between terrorist, insurgent, criminal activity. So, intro, what is a terrorist? Why do we consider certain people terrorists, other people freedom fighters, other people criminals? The old cliche is one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. So how do we differentiate between the two? Before we get started, I just want to say that it's important to make the distinction, to actually classify certain people as terrorists. We do this because we get to do certain things to terrorists, or if we classify you as a terrorist, we get to do certain things to you that we couldn't otherwise. We get to hold you in Guantanamo Bay. We get to give you a military tribunal and not put you in the civil court system. If we say you're a terrorist, we can actually have a predator strike against you over a sovereign border into another sovereign country. So we can't just haphazardly call people terrorists. We can't just say you're a terrorist and we can do all sorts of things to you. So we have to have a very precise legal definition of what is terrorist. And some of the things that I think we, as a Western society, as the United States, kind of characterize as terrorism, or I should say 4 concepts that we classify someone as a terrorist. First, they have to be a non-state actor. Second, that action has to be targeting civilians. Third, it has to be what I call as low-level tactics, ambushes, IEDs, bombings, etc. And then the fourth, the action has to have a certain political objective. So in the West, usually a non-state actor targeting civilians, using low-level tactics to achieve a certain political objective is what we would consider a terrorist. Now, there's a lot of things wrong with this definition. I'm going to cover each one. I'm going to actually go into each one why I think it's kind of a misnomer. So the first thing I said was terrorist is a non-state actor. We say Al-Qaeda is a non-state actor, Hezbollah, Hamas, they're all non-state actors, and we don't usually attribute terrorism to states, although we have in the past. Now, there have been several problems with this definition. States have participated in terrorism. North Korea is an example. Syria in the past. Iran. These are all what we call state-sponsored of terrorism. So we can't just say a non-state actor is a driver of terrorist activity. And more importantly, just because it's a state, can we say that if it uses violence, does that confer legitimacy? Certain terrorist activities might be bad, but there are certainly actions by states that could be considered terrorist-like. So I don't like the non-state definition, or saying that a terrorist has to be a non-state actor for precisely those reasons. If you say it's a non-state actor, then you're implying that state actions or state uses of violence are acceptable. The second component, targeting civilians. This is usually the case, but we've called organizations that have, and we've called certain incidents, acts of terrorism that have targeted military. The USS Cole in 2000, we consider an act of terrorism. The attack on the Pentagon in 9/11, we consider an act of terrorism. The Hezbollah barracks bombing in 1983, again, we consider acts of terrorism. The other point I want to make, and this is more a moral point, is legitimacy. So we say if you target civilians, if Osama bin Laden kills 2,000 people on 9/11, we say that's unacceptable. But if he kills 18 soldiers on the USS Cole, we almost say that's just as bad. And that's probably my problem with targeting or using a civilian targeting as or some of the definitions we have with terrorism. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Again, personal belief, attacking or killing civilians is much more different than killing military. And I'll go as far as to say that it is more legitimate to kill soldiers, whether they be the Hezbollah attack in 1983 or the USS Cole attack. That is more legitimate than some of the direct targeting of civilians that the United States did during World War II. That's my personal opinion, but you can see how the definitions of terrorism could get convoluted. So the third thing we always say is low-level tactics. We usually say if a terrorist conducts a bombing, an IED, hostage-taking, even some sort of WMD incident, we say, hey, that's part of the nomenclature for an act of terrorism. However, what are low-level tactics? Why is a bombing outside of an embassy or a bombing outside a target, why is that terrorism, but a predator drone attacking another target, that's not terrorism? We can't just look at the tactic, even though we as Westerners tend to say, oh, it's got to be terrorism if it's a bombing, if it's a Trek bomb. So I always kind of have that issue with some of our conceptions. And then finally, I think this is actually we can agree on, is terrorism has a political objective. This is what separates terrorists from criminal elements. We hope to, a terrorist hopes to achieve some sort of objective beyond killing that person, while a criminal might only want to just kill the victim or actually just rob somebody. The higher political objective is what we assert to terrorism. So I'll talk about what I think is a good definition, but that's probably the problems I have with what we normally think of as terrorism. There's moral objections, there's historical objections to say that a terrorist has to be a non-state actor, or a terrorist has to target civilians, or terrorists have to use low-level tactics. So one of the things I'm going to ask on your discussion board is, you tell me the definition of terrorism. What's your definition, or why is targeting civilians, or why are low-level tactics, why are these part of terrorism, or should they be included as terrorism? That'd be a great kind of discussion topic for the next week or so. So before I define terrorism, I just want to go on some of the answers on the earlier discussion board and some of my personal opinions. I asked, is the attack on the Marine barracks, is that terrorism? I don't think it is. Again, personal opinion, attacks on military should not be considered terrorism. Just because they use a truck bomb, just because they killed a lot of people, doesn't make it an act of terrorism. And if I was a judge or if I was a political leader, I would not hold those same people in the same contempt that I would be if the target was civilians. So I just want to make that clear. Atom bomb. I throw this... I do not consider this an act of terrorism, but I think it's a good intellectual exercise to ask why the atom bombs, which specifically targeted civilians, why is that not terrorism? Is it because the victors did it? The United States? Is it because we did it and we were victorious in the war? Why we don't consider it terrorism? That's a good point to think. I mean, we deliberately targeted thousands of civilians. That's in different times, that would be a criminal act. In fact, Curtis LeMay, who's had responsibilities for the atom bomb, said if we had lost the war, we would all be tried as war criminals. So why is the atom bomb not an act of terrorism? Someone might say, well, it was there to shorten the war, and we had to do it to save lives. Well, Osama bin Laden conducted the 9/11 attacks because he saw that there was war between the United States and the Islamic world, and he wanted to shorten the war. So, I'll leave that up to you guys whether to decide the atom bomb was an act of terrorism. Attack on the Pentagon, purely military target, but yet we consider that a terrorist attack. Attack on the Pentagon is a little bit different because they use civilians and the airline to actually focus that. But if they had not been, I think most people could agree that the attack on the Pentagon was a more legitimate target. Sorry. The Fort Hood massacre. That's still debated if that's an act of terrorism or not. Personally, again, I will still go under the cloud that if it's against a military target, it's not really an act of terrorism. It has a little bit more legitimacy. But it did have a political objective. He was in coordination with other terrorists. Did that constitute an act of terrorism? I don't know. The DC sniper, I think we can kind of say this is criminal. A lot of people said it was a terrorist act because it was a Muslim family that did it. I don't necessarily buy that. I would say that this was a criminal act. There was no greater objective there. And then an attack on the USS Cole I talked about earlier. I would have a problem, again, considering attacks on military targets on the same category as civilian targets. Again, the USS Cole was in not a hostile, but a foreign port. It was a military target. Whether it was a legitimate target or not is irrelevant, but it had a greater sense of legitimacy than attacks purely on civilians. So that's kind of where I'm going with it. And if you disagree, please add that to the discussion board. We'll just have a little fun with that. So, what is a better definition of terrorism? I think a definition of terrorism, would be a group that conducts a singular attack to reinforce a political narrative, that lacks popular support to advance a political objective. Let me say that again. It's a group that conducts a singular attack to reinforce a narrative, does not have popular support in the targeted location to advance a political objective. And I bring that definition because it's, I want to say it's a singular attack. It's not part of a war. It's not part of an insurgency. It's more of a one-shot strike. Always trying to reinforce a narrative or trying to achieve a political objective. And I say the popular support or lacks popular support because I want to differentiate terrorism and insurgency. For me, an attack in Iraq against a convoy by an IED is more an act of insurgency. That's one of many attacks in an area where the attackers have popular support. If that same attack was conducted in New York, obviously Al-Qaeda does not have popular support in New York. That's what makes it a terrorist attack, not part of an insurgency. We can argue about what popular support is, but I think the difference between attacks in Iraq and the difference between attacks in New York, you can make that one has more popular support than the other. Okay? So with that, I just want to leave you with some questions. I've alluded to, should we consider attacks on military as terrorist attacks? As you know, I come down on one side of this, but I'd be interested to hear your opinions. So please put those on the discussion boards. Second, just debating point, state actions confer sense of legitimacy. They do in our society, but do they really? Does the fact that we bombed Dresden, we bombed Hiroshima, we bombed Nagasaki, we did it because the United States does it, and we're supposed to be the power of good, and that's why we can deliberately target civilians. Those are the arguments made back in World War II, but does that actually confer some sort of legitimacy? And again, this perfect argument for the discussion board or maybe on the exam. And then final discussion point, terrorism versus insurgency. I'm pretty clear on what the difference is. Again, the insurgent has some sort of popular support in the area targeted. So if he's conducting IED attacks, multiple IED attacks over and over again, it's usually because he has some sort of sanctuary right there. If we were to conduct the same attack in New York, he'd find it a lot more difficult, and usually can only do one attack or very time-constrained attack because he doesn't have popular support. The civilians would turn any terrorist in like that. So that's what separates the actions of terrorists versus the actions of insurgents. So with that being said, I just want to really quickly cover week 3 readings. The Byman piece